40%. That's the number you need to hold in your head for the next 7 minutes. 40% of America's hydroelectric power comes from a river that starts in Canada, not near the border, not shared equally. Starts in Canada, flows south, and by the time it reaches the Pacific Northwest, it is already carrying the weight of an entire regional economy on its back. Homes, factories, data centers, $8 billion in crops, 42 million tons of cargo every year. All of it runs on water that Canada controls before it ever touches American soil. And in July of last year, Donald Trump quietly canceled the 61-year-old treaty that kept that arrangement running. He didn't do it with a speech. He did it with a procedural cancellation that most American voters never heard about. He believed Canada would blink. Canada did not blink. And right now, the most consequential piece of cross-border infrastructure in North America is sitting in a legal gray zone that Washington doesn't control, Ottawa is comfortable maintaining, and the Pacific Northwest is quietly panicking about. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to 1948. That spring, a massive flood on the Columbia River destroyed the city of Vanport, Oregon. Around 50 people died. 46,000 lost their homes in a single event. And what Washington learned that week was something that couldn't be fixed with dam building on the American side. The problem was upstream, in Canada. What followed was 16 years of negotiation across 3 administrations, and finally, in 1964, the Columbia River Treaty was ratified and in effect. What Canada agreed to do under that treaty was genuinely costly. Canada built 3 dams in British Columbia, flooded 110,000 hectares of its own territory, displaced First Nations communities, and drowned entire villages. In exchange, the United States paid Canada for half the additional hydropower generated on the American side because of Canadian flow control. That payment has been worth between $180 million and $300 million every year for 6 decades. That was the deal. And for 60 years, it worked. Grand Coulee Dam, the single largest hydropower producer in the entire United States, sits on the Columbia. The Bonneville Power Administration operates 31 federal dams on the Columbia system. Every one of those dams runs on water whose flow is regulated upstream by Canadian infrastructure. $8 billion of American crops are irrigated by that same water. 42 million tons of American commercial cargo move on that river every year, representing around 10% of the nation's total wheat exports. All of it depends on what happens upstream in Canada before the river ever reaches the border. When the original treaty's flood control provisions expired in September of 2024, the Biden administration had a modernized version nearly ready. An agreement in principle had been reached in July of 2024, but Biden couldn't get it to a Senate vote before his term ended. Interim agreements were locked in before the transition, which meant that when Trump took office, he inherited a treaty that was legally in place but structurally unfinished, one that needed final ratification to become permanent and would otherwise default back to its 1964 text. In March of 2025, Trump paused all further engagement on the modernized deal. By July of 2025, he canceled it outright. And here is where the strategic assumption completely collapsed. Because the moment Trump canceled the modernized agreement, the treaty didn't disappear. It reverted to its original 1964 text, which is exactly the version where Canada controls the flow, collects its payments, and owes no new concessions to the United States. Trump thought he was canceling an American concession. He was actually canceling the modernization that Washington needed, and Canada didn't. That is the single most consequential strategic error of his second term on the trade file. There's a professor named Barbara Cozens, a leading expert on transboundary water policy, who said something that cuts right to the heart of this. When asked what happens if the United States and Canada break the Columbia River Treaty, she said, "It is better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a right." That's the whole analysis. The legal structure doesn't matter. The tariff leverage doesn't matter. The water comes from the north. The country that sits on top of the water controls the water. That is not politics. That is geography. There was a warning sign even before the cancellation. In September of 2024, Trump held a press conference where a reporter asked him about California's water crisis. Trump answered by describing Canada as having a very large faucet. He said Canada could turn it and water would flow to Los Angeles in a single day. Hydrology experts spent a week explaining that this is not how water works. There is no faucet. There is no pipe between British Columbia and Los Angeles. But none of that mattered, because the underlying assumption that Canada's water was somehow American water waiting to be claimed is the same assumption that drove every decision the administration made about the Columbia River Treaty afterward. They canceled the modernized deal because they believed the water was theirs. The water was never theirs. So what happens now? I see three realistic paths forward. The first, and I put the probability at around 20%, is that Washington quietly reopens negotiations within the next 90 days. Trump accepts that the cancellation was a mistake without ever saying so publicly, and the Biden-era modernized agreement comes back to the table with minor adjustments. Canada accepts because a ratified treaty is better than an interim one. The relationship stabilizes. That's the optimistic path, and the reason I'm putting it at only 20% is that nothing in Trump's pattern of behavior since January suggests the capacity for that kind of quiet reversal. The second scenario, which I think is the most likely at around 45%, is that negotiations stay frozen through the summer. Interim agreements continue to hold the system together. The Pacific Northwest absorbs no immediate disruption. Canada keeps collecting its entitlement payments. Washington keeps receiving its water. But the modernized treaty never gets finalized, and the relationship settles into a kind of infrastructure purgatory. Everything keeps working as long as nothing breaks. The problem is that rivers do break. A drought year, a heavy snowmelt, a flood event like 1948. The moment anything unusual happens in the watershed, the lack of a coordinated agreement becomes the crisis. The third scenario, at around 35%, is rupture. Trump escalates. He follows through on the 100% tariff on Canadian electricity. Canada responds by formally reducing cooperative flow adjustments to the minimum legally required under the 1964 text. Hydropower producers in the Pacific Northwest start warning of shortages. Agricultural producers warn of irrigation disruption. Commercial shippers warn of cargo delays. The 10-year treaty termination clock starts in Ottawa, not Washington, because Canadian public opinion has hardened into a position that water is not a trade chip. And over the following decade, the most consequential piece of cross-border infrastructure in North America is slowly dismantled. The Pacific Northwest, which for 60 years has been the cheapest hydroelectric region in the developed world, loses that advantage permanently. Three paths, one river, 40% of American hydropower, $8 billion in crops, 42 million tons of cargo, and a Canadian Prime Minister who is not negotiating with tariffs but with geography. When Trade Representative Greer stood before Congress and demanded 5 concessions from Canada, he did not mention the Columbia River once. When Howard Lutnick called Carney irrational at a public event, he did not mention the Columbia River once. When the White House threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian electricity and auto exports, it did not mention the Columbia River once, because mentioning it would expose the structural problem Washington is quietly hoping Ottawa never presses. Canada is upstream. Canada has the shovel, and the shovel is enough.